Hello everyone, welcome to GS Booster Short, your daily dose for GS preparations. In our today's lecture, we're going to talk about the COP26, which is taking place at the very moment in Glasgow. So, this time the Conference of Parties is being hosted by UK in partnership with Italy. Although this conference has to go on for another 10-12 days, however, let's take this opportunity to understand a bit about as to what is COP, what are the agendas for this very meetings, and what has India proposed from its side. Later on, after the conclusion of this very summit, we'll revisit this topic and complete it more holistically. So, let us see a brief background as to how Conference of Parties started. So, it comes under the United Nations Climate Change Framework Convention, that is the UNFCCC, and Conference of Parties was formed under UNFCCC in 1994. So, UNFCCC was established to work towards the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. So, it has laid down a list of responsibilities that every member who is a party to this Conference of Parties has to take up. Number one is formulating measures to mitigate climate change. First of all, every party has to see as to how can they contribute towards mitigation of climate change. Then, cooperating and preparing for adaptation to the impact of climate change. Various recent reports from a study of them shows that today it would be impossible for us to imagine that we can completely digress the impact of climate change upon us. Therefore, whatever we do today, we have to take up certain adaptation measures as well in order to avoid the costs which we have to pay in future with respect to climate change. And therefore, cooperation in the field of adaptation is very important. It is in this relation only that India had launched the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Then, promoting education, training and public awareness related to climate change. So, climate change is such a topic in which contribution from every individual is required. Every individual is part of the problem and has to be part of the solution in order to meet this very challenge. Therefore, it is extremely necessary that public is made aware about it. We have recently seen in many European countries the coming up of green parties. It shows that yes, the climate awareness in those very areas is pretty good. That now climate change has started featuring in their election basically demands. Whereas with respect to third world countries, this has still not attained that sort of level of, I'd say, the popularity, this very issue, and therefore there's a constant need towards educating the population with respect to climate change. So, the UNFCCC has about 198 parties. This includes major polluters of the world, and I'm sorry to say our country also features in it, that is India, China and the USA. So, COP members have been meeting every year since 1995. So, from 1995 onwards, all the parties have been meeting every year in order to discuss the developments with respect to basically change in climate change and what are their actions with respect to it. Let us have a look at some of the important summits of Conference of Parties. So, till date there have been about 25 such summits. 26th one is going on right now in Glasgow. The first summit took place in Berlin in 1995. The fact that all the countries came together and sat over this very issue was indeed itself an achievement. Then COP3 was held in Kyoto in Japan in 1997, and this gave us the Kyoto Protocol, which was effective from 2005 onwards. So, it committed the member states to pursue limitation or reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So, it basically laid down responsibilities on the countries so as to reduce their greenhouse gas production. Then, COP8 was actually hosted by Delhi in 2002 and what were the developments? Basically, this very conference, we arrived at certain convergences towards sharing of technology with respect to climate change, including energy, transport and R&D, and strengthening of institutions for sustainable development. Now, in the recent times, the most important COP was that of 2021 in the Paris. Why this was important was, over here the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, in which significant contributions were announced by all the major polluters towards mitigating climate change. Now, what is the significance of this year's COP? Basically, various reports of IPCC has actually confirmed today that humanity cannot today mitigate the climate challenge. And besides this, the scope of action, if we have to take any sort of an action today, it is an urgent requirement. Therefore, this event would be necessary and will be seen as the step that countries have taken towards climate change. So, thousands of negotiators, researchers and citizens are coming together to strengthen a global response to the threat of climate change. It is a pivotal movement for the world to come together and accelerate the climate action plan after COVID pandemic. So the world has seen how collective misery looks like. In COVID misery, the entire world was together, and no one could have been able to escape it. In a similar manner, if there are any countries which feel or earlier felt that they could actually mitigate, or they would not be basically facing any harsh climatic conditions, it is a falsity, and therefore it is high time, if not now, then it was never. Now, let us have a look at the agendas which have been set by the organizing party of COP26 for this very conference. The first one is towards securing a global net zero commitment by mid-century. That would help keeping the increase in climate temperature to about 1.5 degrees Celsius from the Industrial Revolution onwards. So India, in its recently announced contributions, have said that it is going to achieve net zero by 2070. So let us see. First of all, in order to actually achieve net zero, what would have been done? There is an enhanced need to phase out coal from the energy mix, curtailment of deforestation, speed up the switch to electric vehicles, and encourage investments in renewables. The thought process that has been said that the governments should stop financing basically coal powered plants or plants using fossil fuels to generate electricity. Although the countries have come to an agreement, G20 countries have come to an agreement that from now onwards they are not going to finance any such project outside their country. But there is still time to see that these countries should also commit, all the countries should also commit that they would stop financing basically plants running on fossil fuels in their countries itself as well. Then there is a need to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. As I've already told you that climate change is going to happen and no one can actually stop it. What we can only do is mitigate or actually reduce its impact. However, we still have to go through the impact of it, and therefore this basically adaptation is required. So climate change is already changing it, and it will continue to change even as we reduce emissions with devastating effects. At COP26, we need to work together to enable and encourage countries affected by climate change, protect and restore ecosystems, build defenses, warning systems, resilient infrastructure and agriculture to avoid loss of homes and livelihoods and even lives. So with respect to we see in India, our eastern coast is actually facing more strengthening cyclones every year, for example in the states of Odisha and Andhra Pradesh, and therefore there is an extreme need towards building up defenses, reclaiming wastelands and whatever ecosystem gets destroyed, we need to reinforce that very ecosystem. For example, the Sundarbans. The mangroves in Sundarbans have been a very important protective feature for the state of West Bengal. Then, third is to mobilize finance. Basically, the developed world countries had said that they would be providing at least $100 billion every year towards climate finance. However, they are yet to make up on this very commitment, and therefore without mobilizing finance, there is hardly any possibility towards securing this prevention of climate change, because the developing world would require this very finance, who are having nascent economies and basically are dependent on fossil fuels. Therefore, what is required is transfer of technology as well as this very finance, so that climate technologies and infrastructure with respect to preventing climate change can be built up in these very countries. Lastly, there is a need to work together in order to deliver these lofty goals. We can only rise to the challenge of climate crisis by working together. At COP26, the UK says that we should finalize Paris rule book. This would be a very important thing, and if this rule book has been finalized, then the Paris Agreement would become operational and accelerate action to tackle climate crisis through collaboration between governments, businesses and civil societies. As I've already told you that we need participation from businesses, civil society and every individual, and therefore it has to be seen as to how businesses can contribute to it, how civil society can contribute to it as well. So, what has India declared? What would be India's contribution in this very regard of climate change? So, there are 5 contributions that India has actually said. First, it is said that we are going to take non-fossil fuel energy capacity to 500 gigawatt by 2030. India had already earlier set a target of 450 gigawatt. It has now enhanced it 50 gigawatts from that very target. So it appears to us, with the tremendous increase in solar energy and the way things are going on, that India would very easily achieve this very target. Then, an extremely ambitious target, we were not really hoping that India would commit to any net zero target. So, however, India has committed to net zero by 2070. So, earlier India had rejected calls to announce a target. So this is a give. नेट जीरो का मतलब क्या होता है? नेट जीरो मीन्स कि सारी मैनमेड ग्रीन हाउस एमिशंस उतने ही होंगे जितना कि एनवायरनमेंट एब्जॉर्ब कर सकता है बाय मीन्स ऑफ फोटोसिंथेसिस, या फिर हम फिजिकली उन्हें रिमूव कर सकें. देन थर्ड इज मीटिंग 50% ऑफ आवर एनर्जी रिक्वायरमेंट्स फ्रॉम रीन्यूएबल्स बाय 2030. सो 2030 तक हमारे एनर्जी मिक्स के अंदर से फॉसिल फ्यूल्स का हिस्सा सिर्फ 50% रहे और बाकी सारी एनर्जी थ्रू रीन्यूएबल से आए. ये हमारा टारगेट है. इसमें न्यूक्लियर भी बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट रोल प्ले करेगा. देन रिड्यूस टोटल प्रोजेक्टेड कार्बन एमिशंस बाय 1 बिलियन टन्स फ्रॉम नाउ टू 2030. So every year basically what happens is it is projected that India's basically carbon emission would increase about 4 billion tons. So if we are to look at from this very perspective, by 2030 we would be having some about, at today we are having about a 3.5 to 4 billion tons of carbon released every year, and by 2030 it is expected that this would reach to 35 to 40 billion tons, and a 1 billion ton reduction would roughly mean about 2 to 3% of reduction, and this therefore looks like a very fairly achievable target. Then reduce economy's carbon intensity to less than 45% by 2030. Earlier also we had set a target of about 35%. Now we have raised this target up to 45%. This means that for every 1% of GDP, how much basically carbon intensity is there, how much carbon is basically generated, we are going to reduce that to 45%, less than 45%. So that will be all for today. If you have any doubts, feel free to put your doubts in the comment section. I'd be more than happy to reply to them. Thank you and have a nice day.